CEO proposed to a poor woman on camera, then whispered, "Trust me, this will save you." It wasn't love, it was panic, caught live on camera. A powerful CEO, cornered by reporters, drops to one knee and proposes to a poor black woman no one even knew existed. As the crowd cheers, he leans close and whispers, "Trust me, this will save you." Overnight, her life changes. New clothes, a safe bed, a future she never dreamed of. But behind the smiles and flashing lights, there's a secret. The lie that saved her may have destroyed people just like her. Now she must choose, stay silent and stay safe, or tell the truth and lose everything. Will he destroy her to save himself, or lose everything to finally become the man she deserves? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The first hints of dawn painted Chicago's sky in soft shades of pink and gray as Lena Brooks slowly opened her eyes. Her neck ached from another night spent sleeping in the cramped front seat of her 2002 Toyota Corolla. The familiar musty scent of old upholstery filled her nostrils as she blinked away the remnants of uneasy dreams. The parking lot behind Wilson's grocery store was empty this early, just as she'd hoped it would be. She'd discovered this quiet spot 3 weeks ago, after the landlord had changed the locks on her apartment. The store's security light provided just enough illumination to help her feel safe, but not so much that it kept her awake. Lena's hands moved carefully over the soft wool blanket covering her legs. The fabric was worn thin in places, but the familiar pattern of faded blue flowers still brought comfort. Her grandmother had crocheted this blanket years ago, back when Lena still had a real home. Now it was one of the few possessions she'd managed to keep. "Thank you, Lord, for keeping me safe another night," she whispered, following her grandmother's tradition of starting each day with gratitude. "Please help me do my best today." The digital clock on her dashboard read 6:15 in the morning. Lena folded the blanket with practiced care, smoothing each crease before placing it in the back seat alongside her small duffel bag of clothes. She pulled down the sun visor and checked her reflection in the mirror. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but a splash of cold water from her water bottle and a quick brush through her hair would help her look presentable enough for work. The catering company had called late last night, desperate for extra servers for a corporate breakfast event. Lena had nearly cried with relief when she got the call. The $75 she'd earned today would mean she could fill her gas tank and maybe buy some fresh fruit from the discount produce stand. She changed quickly in the back seat, thankful for the early hour when few people were around. The black pants and white, button-up shirt were wrinkled, but she'd pressed them as best she could using the hand steamer at the laundromat 2 days ago. Her sensible black shoes were scuffed but clean. Appearance mattered in service work, as her grandmother had always reminded her. The morning air held a spring chill as Lena stepped out of her car, her breath forming small clouds in front of her face. She tucked her server's apron and name tag into her small shoulder bag and began the 15-minute walk toward downtown. The streets were starting to wake up. Delivery trucks rumbled past, and early morning commuters hurried toward bus stops and train stations. As she walked, Lena noticed more people gathering on the sidewalks, but these weren't the usual morning commuters. Small groups were forming, some carrying handmade signs. She tried to keep her eyes forward, but the words jumped out at her anyway. "Stop corporate greed! Houses not profits! Families over finance!" Her steps slowed as she passed one group. An elderly woman held a sign that read, "Lost my home of 30 years." The woman's face was lined with dignity and grief, and for a moment their eyes met. Lena's throat tightened. She recognized that look. It was the same one she saw in her own mirror, the face of someone who'd lost not just a place to live, but a sense of security and belonging. The protesters were gathering in front of Meridian Tower, a gleaming 60-story building of steel and glass that seemed to pierce the morning sky. It was also where Lena's catering assignment would be taking place. The contrast between the pristine lobby she could see through the windows and the growing crowd of protesters made her stomach clench. She understood their anger. How could she not? Just 3 weeks ago, she'd been one of countless tenants forced out when their apartment building was bought by a large corporation. The new owners had doubled the rent with barely a month's notice. But understanding didn't pay bills or provide shelter. Today, she needed to work. Lena clutched her shoulder bag closer and weaved through the growing crowd. Some of the protesters were setting up a small sound system, their voices beginning to echo off the surrounding buildings. "Housing is a human right," they chanted. Each word felt like a personal blow, but Lena kept walking. The security guard at the building's entrance watched the protesters warily as he checked Lena's catering credentials. The lobby's warmth enveloped her as she stepped inside, the marble floors gleaming under soft lighting. Everything here spoke of wealth and power, the massive art installations, the designer furniture, the fresh flowers arranged in tall vases. As the glass doors closed behind her, muffling the sounds of the protest outside, Lena felt the weight of 2 worlds pressing against her. She stood in the space between them, understanding the pain and anger of those outside while needing the work this building offered. Her grandmother's words echoed in her memory. Sometimes the Lord puts us right where we need to be, even if we don't understand why. Taking a deep breath, Lena straightened her shoulders and headed toward the service elevator. She didn't know why she was here, in this place, on this particular morning. But she knew she would do what she'd always done: work hard, treat others with kindness, and trust that somehow it would be enough. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Lena stepped inside. As they closed, separating her from both the protesters' chants and the lobby's luxury, she couldn't shake the feeling that this day would be different from any other. She pulled out her name tag and pinned it carefully to her shirt, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Julian Reed stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 58th floor of Meridian Tower, adjusting his Italian silk tie for the 3rd time in as many minutes. The Chicago skyline stretched before him, a vista he'd worked 15 years to earn, but this morning the familiar view brought no comfort. His computer chimed again, another email notification. They'd been streaming in since dawn, each one adding to the weight pressing down on his shoulders. Julian's jaw tightened as he returned to his desk, the leather chair creaking softly as he sat down. "Mr. Reed," his computer announced in its robotic voice. "New message from Thompson Holdings." Julian clicked the email open, though he already knew what it would say. The words confirmed his fears. "In light of recent allegations, regrettably must withdraw our investment commitment. Reputation concerns." He closed the message and glanced at his inbox. 23 unread emails from reporters, 6 from board members, 3 from legal, and 1 from a number he recognized instantly: his mother's. The voicemail icon blinked accusingly beside her name. "Not now," he muttered, swiping the notification away. He couldn't deal with family drama today of all days, couldn't bear to hear her gentle reproach about choices made and values compromised. Instead, Julian pulled up the document containing his press conference talking points. The words blurred together as he read them for what felt like the 100th time. "Meridian Financial remains committed to ethical business practices. Our housing development initiatives prioritize community welfare. These allegations are baseless and will be addressed through proper channels." The words rang hollow even in his head. Julian stood again, pacing the length of his office. The morning's newspaper lay on the coffee table, its headline screaming in bold letters. Meridian Financial accused of predatory housing practices. Below it, smaller but no less damning. Thousands of families displaced as corporate giant gobbles up affordable housing. His phone buzzed. Sandra, his executive assistant. "Sir, Channel 7 is asking for a comment before the press conference, and the Times reporter wants to know about the Winston Heights project specifically." Julian's stomach clenched. Winston Heights, the development that could bring everything crashing down if anyone dug deep enough. "No comments before the conference," he replied firmly. "And make sure legal reviews all questions before they're submitted." He returned to the window, loosening his tie slightly. Below, he could see the protesters gathering in larger numbers now. Their signs were like tiny accusations pointed directly at his office. 15 years of carefully calculated decisions, of putting profits over people, because that's what the business world demanded. 15 years of telling himself the end justified the means. A movement in the hallway caught his attention through the glass wall of his office. A woman in catering uniform was helping an elderly man to a chair in the waiting area. The man, Julian recognized him as James Morton, a veteran reporter from the Tribune, looked pale and shaken. The caterer moved with gentle efficiency, getting him seated and producing a bottle of water from her bag. What struck Julian was her calmness. In a building churning with tension and anxiety, she moved with serene purpose, speaking softly to Morton while keeping a respectful distance. No one else in the busy hallway seemed to notice or care. Executives and assistants rushed past, phones to their ears, tablets in hand. Julian watched as she made sure Morton was comfortable, waited until some color returned to his face. She declined what appeared to be an offer of payment, gathering her things with a small smile before continuing down the hallway. No one stopped to acknowledge what she'd done. She simply melted back into the background of the building's frantic activity. His computer chimed again, another email from legal. This one marked urgent with multiple attachments. Julian forced his attention back to the screen, but his mind kept returning to that small act of kindness he'd witnessed. When was the last time he'd done something simply because it was right, with no thought of profit or advantage? The voicemail notification from his mother still blinked in the corner of his screen. Her words from years ago echoed in his memory. "Success isn't about what you gain, Julian. It's about what you give." He'd dismissed such sentiments as naive then, when he was climbing the corporate ladder. Now, with his carefully constructed world threatening to crumble, they stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. Sandra's voice came through the intercom, tight with tension. "Mr. Reed, they're ready for you in the conference room. The press is assembled." Julian straightened his tie one final time, checked his reflection in the window. The man who stared back at him looked polished, confident, successful. Why then did he suddenly feel so fraudulent? "Sir." Sandra's voice held a note of urgency. "They're waiting." He gathered his tablet. And notes, each movement deliberate and controlled. The weight of what was at stake pressed down on him, the company's future, his legacy, the livelihoods of thousands of employees. And somewhere, buried beneath corporate spreadsheets and legal documents, the truth about Winston Heights and all the other developments like it. As Julian walked toward his office door, his mother's voicemail continued to blink, unanswered. The halls were quieter now, everyone gathered in the conference room 2 floors below. Through the windows, he could still see the protesters, their numbers growing. Somewhere out there was that elderly woman he'd seen earlier, holding her sign about losing her home of 30 years. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Inside, Julian pressed the button for the 56th floor, where the conference room waited. His prepared statements felt heavy in his hands, each word carefully crafted to reveal nothing while saying all the right things. The elevator descended, and Julian Reed straightened his shoulders, arranged his features into the mask of confident authority he'd perfected over 15 years. In less than 2 minutes, he would face a room full of reporters eager to tear that mask away. Everything he'd built, everything he'd sacrificed his principles for, balanced on the edge of exposure. The elevator doors opened onto a corridor lined with anxious executives and PR staff. At the end of the hall, through the glass walls of the conference room, camera lights blazed. Sandra waited by the door, clipboard clutched to her chest, her usual composed demeanor showing cracks of concern. "They're ready for you, Mr. Reed." Julian Reed strode to the podium, his footsteps echoing across the suddenly hushed conference room. Camera flashes erupted like lightning, capturing his practiced smile and perfectly knotted tie. He gripped the edges of the podium, scanning the sea of expectant faces before him. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and controlled. "Thank you all for coming today. Reed Enterprises has always prided itself on transparency and—" "Mr. Reed?" A reporter from the Chicago Tribune shot to his feet. "What do you say to allegations that Reed Enterprises deliberately misled residents of Winston Heights about property assessments?" Julian's fingers tightened on the podium. "As I was saying." Another reporter jumped in. "Is it true that your company falsified inspection reports to force out long-term residents?" The carefully prepared statement in front of him blurred. Sweat beaded at his temples despite the room's aggressive air conditioning. More questions flew at him like arrows. What about the elderly woman who lost her home of 30 years? Were building code violations deliberately ignored? Is there any truth to claims of systematic discrimination against low-income residents? Julian's mouth went dry. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the faces before him morphing into a predatory mass. His legal team shifted nervously at the side of the stage. From the corner of his eye, he caught Sandra making frantic gestures. Stick to the script, say nothing substantive, deflect. But the truth sat like acid in his stomach. Every accusation contained a kernel of fact he'd rationalized away over the years. Every evasive answer prepared by his PR team felt like another brick in a wall of lies. Movement near the refreshment table caught his attention. The same caterer from earlier, the one who'd helped Morton, was quietly refilling water pitchers. Something about her calm presence amidst the chaos struck him again. She worked with focused grace, seemingly unaware of the drama unfolding mere feet away. In that moment, as another barrage of questions hammered at him, Julian Reed did something unprecedented in his 15 years of corporate leadership. He acted on pure instinct rather than calculation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he cut through the noise, his voice carrying an authority that momentarily silenced the room. "You're right to ask these questions, but before we address them, I'd like to share something personal." He stepped away from the podium, his heart thundering against his ribs. "Could you join me up here, please?" He gestured toward the catering staff. The woman, her name tag read Lena, looked up in surprise, then glanced behind her as if certain he must be addressing someone else. The room had gone completely still, cameras swiveling to follow Julian's movement as he walked toward her. "Please," he said, extending his hand. His voice carried in the silence, but his eyes locked with hers, communicating a desperate urgency he hoped she could read. Lena hesitated, then set down her pitcher and took his offered hand. Her fingers were cool against his palm, steady despite the confusion evident in her expression. As he led her to the center of the stage, Julian caught glimpses of their image displayed on the monitors around the room. His tailored suit next to her simple black uniform, an unlikely pair in the spotlight. Before doubt could overtake him, Julian dropped to one knee. Gasps rippled through the audience, camera flashes intensified to a storm. With movements that felt both deliberate and dreamlike, he pulled his grandmother's ring from his pocket. The ring he'd carried for years, unable to part with it despite his mother's requests to pass it on. "I've spent my life pursuing success," he said, loud enough for the microphones to catch every word. "Building wealth, achieving power, maintaining control. But watching you today, seeing your quiet kindness and genuine concern for others, I realized what's been missing." The words flowed from somewhere beyond calculation, beyond strategy. "Will you marry me?" The silence in the room was absolute. Lena stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock. Julian could see her pulse fluttering in her throat, her chest barely moving as she held her breath. He rose slightly, still holding her hand, and leaned close to whisper words meant only for her. "Trust me. This will save you." Their eyes met in a moment of silent communication. Julian saw the exact instant she registered the fear behind his confident facade, the desperation beneath his polished exterior. Her gaze flickered to the wall of cameras behind him, then back to his face. Time stretched like taffy. The room waited, hundreds of people holding their breath. Julian could feel his future balancing on a knife's edge, everything he'd built hanging on the response of this woman he'd never spoken to before this moment. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, Lena nodded. "Yes," she said softly, then louder as cameras zoomed in. "Yes." Julian slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. It fit as if it had been made for her, another impossible detail in this surreal moment. The room erupted. Applause thundered off the walls, cameras flashed in a blinding storm, and reporters shouted new questions, their earlier accusations temporarily forgotten in the face of this unexpected romantic drama. Julian stood, drawing Lena close in what appeared to be an embrace of joy. But he felt her slight trembling, saw the dazed look in her eyes as her world tilted on its axis. PR staff swarmed the stage, forming a barrier between them and the press. Sandra appeared at Julian's elbow, already speaking rapidly into her phone, no doubt trying to get ahead of the story that would soon be breaking across every news outlet in Chicago. Through it all, Julian kept hold of Lena's hand, anchoring them both in the chaos they'd just created. The ring glinted on her finger, his grandmother's ring, now binding them together in a deception that might save his company, but would irrevocably change both their lives. The applause continued to roll through the room like waves, carrying with it the sound of 100 stories being rewritten, 100 headlines being revised. But beneath the celebration, Julian could feel the weight of truth still waiting to be faced, and the enormity of what he'd just done settling over him like a shadow. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur for Lena. As soon as the cameras stopped flashing, a well-dressed woman who introduced herself as Sandra whisked her away from the conference room and into a private elevator. Lena's legs felt wobbly, and her heart wouldn't stop racing. "We need to move quickly," Sandra explained, her heels clicking against the marble floor as they emerged into a different part of the building. "There's a lot to handle before the evening news cycle." Before Lena could process what was happening, she found herself in a plush office surrounded by a team of professionals. A lawyer in a crisp navy suit slid a thick document across a mahogany table. "This is a temporary confidentiality agreement," he explained, his voice clipped but not unkind. "It ensures that any discussions about the engagement remain private until we can finalize more permanent arrangements." Lena's hands trembled as she picked up the expensive pen they'd provided. The weight of it felt foreign compared to the cheap ballpoints she usually carried. She skimmed the document, catching phrases like mutual non-disclosure and preliminary terms of agreement. Should I have my own lawyer look at this?" she asked softly. Sandra stepped forward. "That's your right, of course. But this is just temporary protection for both parties while we work out the details. We'll have plenty of time for full legal review later." Lena thought of her car parked behind the grocery store, containing everything she owned in the world. She thought of the ring on her finger. So heavy, so real. With a deep breath, she signed her name. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. A stylist appeared with racks of clothing, holding different pieces up to Lena's face while discussing colors and sizes with her assistant. A PR specialist ran through basic talking points and gave her a card with emergency contact numbers. Someone pressed a sleek new phone into her hands, already programmed with necessary numbers. "The apartment is ready," Sandra announced around 5 o'clock, checking her own phone. "Cars waiting downstairs." They took a different elevator down to an underground parking garage where a black SUV with tinted windows waited. The driver held the door open for her, and Lena slid into the cool leather interior, still wearing her catering uniform. The garment bags of new clothes lay carefully across the seat beside her. The drive wasn't long, but it took them to a part of Chicago Lena hadn't visited in months, the gleaming downtown district where glass and steel buildings reached towards the sky. The SUV pulled into another underground garage, this one beneath a luxury apartment building that made Lena's breath catch. 24th floor, Sandra said, leading her to yet another private elevator. "The apartment has been stocked with essentials, but let me know if you need anything else." The elevator doors opened directly into a foyer larger than some apartments Lena had lived in. Sandra showed her around quickly. Gourmet kitchen, living room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, master bedroom suite, guest rooms, office space. Everything was decorated in soft greys and blues, elegant but impersonal. "The fridge is full," Sandra said, opening it to demonstrate. "Bathroom has all the basics. Here's a building key and fob." She placed them on the granite counter. "Get some rest. Someone will come for you at 9 tomorrow morning." Then Sandra was gone, and Lena stood alone in the vast, quiet space. The sun was setting over Chicago, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks visible through the massive windows. Her catering uniform felt completely out of place against the luxury surrounding her. Moving almost mechanically, Lena went to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator again. It was indeed full. Fresh fruits and vegetables, gourmet prepared meals, bottles of water, juice, and wine. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since her small breakfast in her car that morning. She selected a prepared sandwich and ate it standing at the counter, barely tasting it. Everything felt surreal, like she might wake up at any moment back in her car. This whole day, nothing but a strange dream. The bathroom drew her next. It was larger than her first studio apartment, with a deep, soaking tub, separate shower, and double vanity topped with marble. The cabinets were stocked with high-end toiletries, shampoo that cost more than she used to make in a day, fluffy towels softer than anything she'd ever touched. Lena turned on the shower, adjusting the multiple spray heads until she found a setting that wasn't overwhelming. She stood under the hot water for a long time, letting it wash away the stress and confusion of the day. When she finally stepped out, her skin was pink and her mind slightly clearer. Wrapping herself in one of the cloud-soft towels, she wiped steam from the mirror and stared at her reflection. Her face looked the same as it had that morning. Same brown eyes, same small worry line between her brows. But something fundamental had shifted in her world. The ring caught the light as she raised her hand to touch the mirror. It was beautiful, obviously old and valuable, with delicate metalwork surrounding the central diamond. It felt impossibly heavy on her finger, weighted with meaning and consequences she couldn't yet fully grasp. "Lord," she whispered, her grandmother's favorite prayer rising naturally to her lips. "Grant me wisdom to see the path you've set before me. Grant me strength to walk it with grace. And please," her voice cracked slightly, Please help me understand if this is rescue or trap." The marble bathroom offered no immediate answer, just the soft drip of the shower and the hum of the building's excellent heating system. Lena found soft pajamas among the clothes that had been delivered and pulled them on, marveling at how perfectly they fit. The bed in the master bedroom was huge, piled high with pillows and topped with a downy white comforter. She approached it almost reverently, running her hand over the crisp sheets. How long had it been since she'd slept in a real bed? The months in her car had begun to blur together, marked only by the changing seasons and her grandmother's carefully folded blanket. Lena slipped between the sheets, their cool smoothness enveloping her like a blessing. The mattress cradled her tired body perfectly. She could see the city lights twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows, so different from the dark parking lot she'd grown used to. Safety. The word floated through her mind as her eyes grew heavy. For the first time in months, she felt physically safe. But as sleep began to claim her, uncertainty still swirled. Beneath that safety, questions about tomorrow, about Julian Reed's true motives, about what this sudden change would ultimately mean for her life. The ring glinted in the city light as her hand relaxed against the pillow. Lena's last conscious thought was a repetition of her earlier prayer, for wisdom, for strength, and for clarity about whether this beautiful cage was truly her salvation. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across Lena's new temporary home. She sat at the kitchen island, a cup of herbal tea growing cold beside her as she stared at the newspaper headlines spread before her. The Chicago Tribune's front page proclaimed, "Love conquers all. CEO's surprise proposal wins hearts." Below it, the Wall Street Journal took a more business-focused angle. "Reed Industries' unexpected romance. Markets respond positively." Her phone, a new model provided just last night, buzzed with yet another news alert. Every major outlet seemed determined to spin their love story into something magical. The photos showed Julian on one knee, his face transformed by what looked like genuine emotion. Lena barely recognized herself in the images, her shocked expression now interpreted as demure joy by eager reporters. A soft knock at the door preceded Sandra's entrance. The PR representative looked perfectly put together despite the early hour, her tablet already in hand. "Good morning, Lena. Are you ready for today's schedule?" Lena nodded, smoothing down the simple blue dress that had been selected for her. It fit perfectly, like everything else that had appeared in her closet overnight. "Yes, though I'm not sure what to expect. We're keeping it light for your first official appearance," Sandra explained, leading Lena to the elevator. "Just breakfast with Julian at Maison Azur. The Chicago Morning Show will have a crew there. Very casual, very romantic. The public loves a good love story." The elevator descended smoothly to the private garage where a black SUV waited. As they drove through downtown Chicago, Lena watched the city wake up. Street vendors were setting up their carts, office workers hurried along with coffee cups in hand, and newspaper stands displayed her and Julian's faces everywhere she looked. Maison Azur was an exclusive French restaurant that normally didn't open for breakfast. Today, however, it had been transformed into an intimate setting for two, with soft lighting and fresh flowers everywhere. Julian was already there, dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Lena used to make in 6 months. "Good morning," he said, rising to greet her. His smile was perfect for the cameras already rolling discreetly from strategic positions around the room. He kissed her cheek, his cologne expensive and subtle. "Did you sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," Lena replied softly, letting him pull out a chair. The table was set with delicate china and crystal glasses filled with fresh squeezed orange juice. A basket of still warm croissants sat between them. The interview itself was carefully orchestrated to appear spontaneous. The host, a friendly woman named Margaret Chen, approached their table as if she'd just happened upon them. "Oh my goodness, if it isn't Chicago's newest power couple. Would you mind if we joined you for a moment?" Julian played his part perfectly, appearing both surprised and welcoming. "Please have a seat. We'd love to share our morning with your viewers." Margaret settled into a chair, her camera crew adjusting their positions. "The whole city is talking about yesterday's proposal. Tell us, how did you two first meet?" Lena felt Julian's hand cover hers on the table, a gesture that looked loving, but felt like a gentle warning. They had rehearsed this part. Lena was working at a corporate event. Julian began, his voice warm with practiced affection. "I'd seen her before, always noticed how she treated everyone with such genuine kindness. Yesterday, something just clicked. Sometimes you don't realize what you're looking for until it's right in front of you." Lena managed a shy smile, letting Julian do most of the talking. When she did speak, she kept her answers simple and honest, talking about her grandmother's influence on her life, her belief in treating everyone with respect, her surprise at Julian's proposal. The public would see what they wanted to see. A humble, gracious young woman swept off her feet by a powerful man who'd recognized her inner beauty. After the cameras stopped rolling, Margaret gushed about what great television they'd made. "You two have such natural chemistry. The viewers are going to eat this up." When they were finally alone, or as alone as they could be with security and staff hovering nearby, Julian's warm demeanor cooled noticeably. He leaned closer, speaking quietly. "Thank you for this morning. You handled it well." "How long do we need to keep this up?" Lena asked, her voice equally low. "Just until things stabilize, a few months at most. The company's stock is already recovering." He straightened his tie. "All business now. The apartment and allowance are yours to use freely during that time. Consider it compensation for your discretion." Throughout the day, Lena was shuttled between meetings with various professionals, a personal stylist, an etiquette coach, a financial advisor. Everyone treated her with polite deference, but she caught the sideways glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. Late in the afternoon, she paused outside the ladies' room, hearing voices inside. "Can you believe her luck?" one woman was saying. "From serving coffee to sleeping in the penthouse. Talk about a Cinderella story." "Julian Reed could have any woman in Chicago," another replied. "Wonder what he sees in her." "Oh, please, we all know what he sees. Good PR when he desperately needs it. She's perfect, humble background, pretty but not threatening, no family complications to worry about. The public eats up that rags to riches romance." Lena waited until they left before entering, avoiding her own reflection in the mirror. Their words stung, but not because they were cruel, because they contained too much truth. That evening, back in the quiet luxury of the apartment, Lena sat at the desk in what was now her bedroom. She carefully removed Julian's ring. Her ring, she supposed, at least temporarily, and placed it beside her grandmother's Bible. The leather was worn soft with age and use, the pages marked with decades of notes and prayers. Opening to Proverbs, her grandmother's favorite book, Lena's eyes fell on familiar, highlighted verses about truth and integrity. The ring caught the last rays of sunset, sending small rainbows dancing across the sacred pages. Such a beautiful object, representing such a complicated deception. She touched the ring gently, feeling its weight even when it wasn't on her finger. This wasn't just jewelry anymore. It was a symbol of a lie that had already begun to take root in both their lives. The media was invested, the public was enchanted, and the company's future hung in the balance. What had started as a desperate moment of inspiration was growing into something neither of them could easily undo. Looking out at the Chicago skyline, Lena realized that this temporary arrangement felt anything but temporary. Each interview, each public appearance, each shared glance and staged moment was adding another layer to their fabricated love story. The truth might have set them free, but this lie was binding them together in ways that would be increasingly difficult to unravel. The morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows as Patricia Chen, Chicago's most sought-after etiquette coach, circled Lena like a meticulous hawk. "Back straight, shoulders relaxed," she instructed, adjusting Lena's posture with gentle but firm touches. "Remember, you're not just representing yourself anymore. You're the future Mrs. Reed." Lena fought the urge to slouch under the pressure. Her grandmother had taught her manners, but this was different. A complex dance of social rules and expectations she'd never needed to learn while serving drinks or working catering jobs. "The dessert fork goes here," Patricia demonstrated, moving the silverware. "And when dining formally, work from the outside in." Lena nodded, trying to absorb it all. Her eyes kept drifting to the elaborate place setting before her, more forks than she'd ever owned at once. Next came the wardrobe consultation. Racks of designer clothes filled the penthouse's spare bedroom, tags still attached. The stylist, Marco, pulled out outfit after outfit while discussing the importance of personal branding. "These pieces tell a story," he explained, holding up a cream-colored blazer. "Sophisticated but approachable. Elegant but not intimidating." Lena ran her fingers over the soft fabric, thinking of her grandmother's carefully mended church dresses. "How much does something like this cost?" Marco waved away the question. "Don't worry about prices, darling. It's all been arranged." The afternoon brought them to Julian's personal penthouse, a stark contrast to the corporate apartment where Lena had spent the night. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Lake Michigan. Modern art adorned the walls, and every surface gleamed with careful maintenance. "Maria comes 3 times a week," Julian explained, referring to his housekeeper. As if on cue, an older woman emerged from the kitchen, duster in hand. "Hola, Mr. Reed," she said quietly, keeping her eyes down as she moved to leave the room. "Maria, wait," Lena called out softly. She crossed to the woman, introducing herself in careful Spanish. "I'm Lena. Thank you for keeping such a beautiful home." Maria's face lit up with surprise and pleasure. They chatted briefly in Spanish, with Maria offering congratulations on the engagement. Julian watched the exchange with an unreadable expression. Throughout the tour, Lena noticed small details that spoke of isolation. A pristine kitchen that clearly saw little use, a single coffee cup in the dish drain, no family photos among the carefully curated art pieces. The day's lessons continued over dinner, arranged by Julian's staff in his private dining room. The table could have seated 12, but held only 2 place settings at opposite ends. Lena hesitated before taking her seat, remembering Patricia's instructions about proper dining etiquette. "The photographers have gone home," Julian said, loosening his tie. "You can relax." Lena picked up a fork, the correct one, and gathered her courage. "Can I ask you something?" Julian nodded, checking his phone before setting it aside. "The protesters I saw yesterday morning, before the press conference, they were talking about housing exploitation. What did they mean?" Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Every major development project has its critics. People resist change, even when it's for the better. But they seemed so desperate. Lena pressed gently. One woman was crying about losing her home. "It's complicated," Julian replied, his tone cooling. "The neighborhood needed revitalization. We followed all legal procedures." "Legal doesn't always mean right," Lena said quietly, then immediately wished she could take the words back. Julian studied her for a long moment. You have a remarkable talent for getting to the heart of things, don't you? I'm sorry, she said quickly. It's not my place to question. No, it isn't. He agreed, but his tone had lost some of its edge. But I suppose that's exactly why you're here. The public sees that same directness and thinks it means I must be better than they assumed, that someone like you wouldn't be with someone completely corrupt. The honesty of his statement hung in the air between them. Lena pushed her barely touched food around her plate, using the correct fork with unpracticed precision. You should eat, Julian said finally. Tomorrow will be another long day. After dinner, Lena was escorted back to her corporate apartment. Julian remained in his penthouse, pouring himself a drink as he looked out over the city. He could still hear Lena's gentle questioning, see her easy kindness with Maria. It was unsettling. How naturally she handled both confrontation and compassion, how her presence made his carefully constructed world feel suddenly hollow. He pulled out his phone, intending to check the latest market reports, but instead found himself looking at photos from the day's media coverage. There was Lena, smiling shyly at his side, her borrowed designer clothes somehow failing to mask her authentic warmth. The public was already falling in love with her, just as he'd hoped. What he hadn't counted on was how her sincerity would begin to crack the walls he'd spent years building around himself. Julian set down his glass, the ice cubes clinking in the empty silence of his penthouse. Tomorrow would bring more lessons in how to present their story to the world. But tonight, he couldn't shake the feeling that Lena Brooks might be teaching him something far more important than proper fork placement or public appearances. In her own apartment, Lena changed out of her expensive new clothes and into her familiar nightgown. The day's lessons in etiquette and elegance swirled in her mind, but what stayed with her most was the brief flash of vulnerability she'd seen in Julian's eyes when she'd asked about the protesters. There was pain there, and perhaps something else, a glimmer of conscience beneath the corporate armor. She knelt beside her bed for her nightly prayers, adding a new request to her usual litany. Guidance not just for herself, but for Julian too. Despite his wealth and power, she sensed he might be just as lost as she was, though in a very different way. The Grand Hawthorne Hotel's ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and the flash of diamond jewelry. Lena smoothed the midnight blue gown Julian's stylist had chosen, feeling like an imposter among Chicago's elite. Her engagement ring caught the light, a constant reminder of why she was here. Julian stood beside her, perfectly at ease in his tuxedo, charming potential donors with practiced grace. My fiancé has opened my eyes to the importance of community involvement, he was saying, his hand resting lightly on her back. The touch felt rehearsed, like everything else about their public appearances. The Reed Foundation's commitment to housing initiatives is admirable, a silver-haired woman commented, sipping champagne. Such a pressing issue in our city. Lena's throat tightened. She excused herself quietly, needing air. Instead of heading to the balcony, her feet carried her toward the service entrance, where volunteers were coordinating meal distribution for the homeless shelter portion of the event. "Can I help?" she asked, approaching a woman sorting name tags. The volunteer looked up, startled to see someone in evening wear offering assistance. "Oh, Mrs. Reed, future Mrs. Reed, you don't need to—" "Please," Lena said softly. "I'd like to help, and it's just Lena." For the next hour, Lena listened as volunteers shared stories between tasks. A retired teacher named Marcus described how his entire apartment building had been cleared out for luxury condos. 23 years I lived there, he said, shaking his head. Now I volunteer to keep my mind off things. Sarah, a young mother, wiped tears as she talked about moving her 3 children into her parents' basement after rent increases forced them out of their neighborhood. "The worst part is explaining to my kids why we can't go home." Each story hit Lena like a physical blow, reminding her of her grandmother's struggles to keep their small house after Lena's parents died. The memory of her grandmother's weathered hands counting out pennies for property tax was still vivid. "It's not right," a volunteer named James said quietly. "These big companies buy up whole blocks, force everyone out, then build fancy condos nobody who lived there can afford. They call it progress, but it's just greed wearing a nice suit." Lena's engagement ring felt heavy on her finger. Later, back in Julian's penthouse, Lena knelt beside the leather sofa in the living room. Her formal gown pooled around her as she closed her eyes in prayer. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "please help Marcus find a new home where he can display his students' artwork again. Be with Sarah's children as they adjust to their new situation. Guide James in his efforts to help others." She continued, naming each person she'd met, carrying their burdens to God as her grandmother had taught her. So focused on her prayers, she didn't hear Julian enter the room. Julian stopped in the doorway, arrested by the sight of Lena in her evening gown, head bowed in genuine concern for strangers. The contrast between her simple faith and the calculated networking he'd been doing all evening struck him hard. He watched as she finished her prayers, noted how she touched her grandmother's cross necklace, the only jewelry she wore that hadn't come from his stylists. Something about her sincerity made his chest ache. Later, alone in his home office, Julian pulled out an old photo album he hadn't opened in years. His fingers traced a picture of himself from law school, standing proudly with his mother at a community legal aid clinic where he'd volunteered. The young man in the photo smiled with genuine idealism, believing he could change the world for the better. Julian barely recognized himself. When had that idealistic young lawyer transformed into someone who saw displaced families as acceptable collateral damage for profit? He flipped through more photos. His first day at the firm, early victories in pro bono cases, community outreach events where his smile reached his eyes. The progression was subtle but clear, his suits getting more expensive as his principles became more flexible, his smile growing practiced rather than genuine. The last photo showed him accepting his current position as CEO, standing beside his predecessor with a predatory grin that had nothing to do with justice or community. Julian closed the album, but couldn't escape the weight of what he'd become. Through the open door, he could hear Lena's voice as she spoke quietly on the phone, checking on one of the volunteers who had seemed especially distressed. Her compassion wasn't a corporate strategy or a public relations move. It was simply who she was. The empty crystal tumbler on his desk reflected the city lights streaming through his floor-to-ceiling windows. All this success, all this power, and yet a homeless woman's simple prayers carried more genuine impact than his entire charitable foundation. Julian opened his desk drawer and pulled out another photo, one he kept separate from the others. In it, his mother stood outside their old neighborhood legal aid office, her arm around a young client they'd helped save from eviction. He stared at his mother's proud smile, remembering how she'd fought against the same kind of corporate tactics he now employed. The photo's edges were worn from handling, though he hadn't looked at it in years. Now, with Lena's prayers for strangers still echoing in his mind, he couldn't look away from the evidence of who he'd once been, and everything he'd sacrificed in the name of success. Morning sunlight streamed through the towering glass windows of Reed Enterprises' executive floor. Lena Brooks walked quietly through the maze of corridors, her sensible flats making little sound on the polished marble floors. She'd grown more comfortable navigating the building over the past few days, though its grandeur still felt foreign to her. She was looking for Julian, hoping to discuss an upcoming charity event the PR team had scheduled. The halls were oddly quiet this morning. Most of the staff were attending a training session on a lower floor. As she rounded a corner near the executive conference rooms, voices drifted through a partially open door. The tone made her pause, sharp, urgent, angry. She recognized Julian's voice among them. "The numbers don't lie." A woman's stern voice cut through the air. 43% of those properties were occupied when we acquired them. The displacement statistics are becoming impossible to hide. The legal team has contained most of the complaints. A male voice responded. "But these activist groups are getting organized. They're connecting the dots between the different developments." Lena's hand flew to her grandmother's cross. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but something held her in place. Perhaps the Holy Spirit's gentle nudge that she needed to hear this. Julian's voice came through clearly. "The documentation shows all proper procedures were followed. If anyone looks too closely, they'll find everything in order." A bitter laugh crackled through what must have been a speakerphone. "In order because we made them that way. Those voluntary relocations weren't voluntary at all. We priced them out, cut services, made life impossible until they had no choice but to leave. Then backdated the paperwork to make it look clean." Lena's heart began to pound. She thought of Sarah from the charity gala, forced into her parents' basement with 3 children. Of Marcus, who lost his community art studio. Of her own grandmother, who had struggled so hard to keep their family home. "The Foundation's affordable housing initiative will help offset the optics," Julian said, his tone businesslike. "And the engagement has already redirected media attention. We just need to maintain this course until the development deals close." Speaking of the engagement, another voice chimed in. "Have we fully vetted this woman? We can't afford any complications." "She's clean," Julian replied. "No family connections, no suspicious backgrounds. Perfect for our purposes." Lena backed away from the door, her hands trembling. The marble floors that had seemed so solid now felt like shifting sand beneath her feet. She made her way to the elevator, pressed the button for the private apartment floor, and somehow managed to hold herself together until the doors closed. In the privacy of the elevator, she leaned against the wall, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. "Truth will always rise to the surface, child, like cream in coffee." The truth was rising now, and it was bitter indeed. Hours passed in a blur. Lena moved through her afternoon appointments mechanically, a fitting for another designer dress, a meeting with the wedding planner, a photo shoot for a magazine spread. All of it felt like a cruel joke now. Every luxury around her had been paid for with someone else's suffering. As evening approached, she stepped out onto the balcony of her temporary apartment. The city spread out below her, a glittering tapestry of lights and shadows. From this height, the protesters weren't visible anymore. Their signs couldn't be read. Their voices couldn't be heard. Was that the point of these towers? To lift the wealthy so high they couldn't see the damage they caused below? Lena sank into one of the cushioned chairs, wrapping her grandmother's old sweater around her shoulders despite the warm evening. She'd brought it from her car, needing its familiar comfort. The ring on her finger caught the fading sunlight, throwing fractured rainbows against the glass balcony wall. Beautiful, but built on lies. She thought of Julian's words in the conference room. So casual about destroying lives, so calculated in using her to distract from the truth. The safety she'd felt these past few days had been an illusion. Worse, it had been bought with the suffering of people just like her. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she remembered her grandmother's struggles after Lena's parents died. How many times had they nearly lost their home? How many nights had her grandmother stayed up, wrestling with bills, trying to hold on to the only stability Lena had left? By God's grace and her grandmother's determination, they'd managed to keep their home. Others hadn't been so blessed. The city lights blurred through her tears. Somewhere out there, families were being pushed from their homes by the very policies she'd overheard. Children were wondering why they couldn't go back to their neighborhoods. Communities were being torn apart, all in the name of profit. And here she sat, in a luxury apartment paid for by the same company doing the destroying. The food in her refrigerator, the clothes in her closet, even the bed she slept in, all of it came from money made by hurting others. Lena clutched her grandmother's cross, its familiar shape offering little comfort tonight. "Lord," she whispered, "how did I end up here? What am I supposed to do?" The evening breeze carried no answer, only the distant sounds of the city below. She thought of Julian's practiced smile in their public appearances, how different it was from his cold efficiency in that conference room. He'd asked her to trust him, claimed he was saving her. But salvation built on others' destruction wasn't salvation at all. Her temporary safety now felt like a prison. Every comfort around her represented someone else's loss. Every moment she spent playing this role helped distract from the truth of what was happening to vulnerable families across the city. The sun had fully set now, leaving her in darkness broken only by the city's artificial glow. Lena remained on the balcony, her grandmother's sweater pulled tight around her shoulders, wrestling with the weight of what she'd learned. Her safety had come at a terrible price, not just her own integrity, but the well-being of countless others who had no voice against the corporate machine that had ensnared her. The ring felt heavier than ever on her finger as night settled over Chicago. Each glitter of its diamonds reminded her of tears shed by those who had lost their homes. Her temporary salvation had become a gilded cage, and she was helping keep others locked outside in the cold. The following afternoon, Lena stood on the worn steps of Eleanor Price's modest home, her heart pounding. The small house looked exactly as she remembered it. Cheerful yellow paint, overflowing flower boxes, and a welcome mat that read, "Come as you are, leave better." For years, this had been her safe harbor during life's storms. She knocked softly, adjusting the designer purse that felt so out of place here. The door opened, and Eleanor's warm brown eyes widened in recognition. "Lena, oh, sweetheart." The older woman pulled her into a tight embrace that smelled of cinnamon and coffee, scents that had always meant home. "I saw you on the news," Eleanor said as she ushered Lena inside. "I've been praying for you every day." The familiar living room was unchanged, mismatched furniture arranged for conversation, not show, and walls covered with photos of the many lives Eleanor had touched through her ministry. Lena spotted herself in several. At church camp, at her high school graduation, praying with Eleanor after her grandmother's funeral. "I'm in trouble, Eleanor," Lena whispered as they sat together on the worn floral couch. Not the kind that shows on the outside, but... Her voice cracked. Eleanor took her hands, weathered fingers gentle against Lena's manicured ones. "Start from the beginning, child." So Lena did. She explained everything. The desperate months living in her car, the catering job, Julian's unexpected proposal, and finally, the devastating truth she'd overheard yesterday. The words poured out like a river breaking through a dam, carrying all her confusion and pain with them. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression compassionate but grave. When Lena finished, silence filled the room for several long moments. "The devil's craftiest trick," Eleanor finally said, "isn't offering us evil wrapped in darkness. It's offering us comfort wrapped in compromise." She squeezed Lena's hands. "You've been given safety and security, things you desperately needed, but they came with strings attached to others' suffering." Lena nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know what to do. If I walk away now, nothing changes. Those families still lose their homes. But if I stay, then you become complicit in their pain." Eleanor finished gently. "Sweetheart, truth doesn't stop being truth just because it arrives wrapped in luxury. God didn't bring you into this situation so you could ignore injustice from a comfortable distance. But what can I do? I'm nobody. Just a homeless woman Julian used for publicity. Eleanor's eyes flashed. You stop that right now. You are a child of God, and He doesn't make mistakes. Maybe you're exactly where you need to be to make a difference. They talked for hours, Eleanor's wisdom helping Lena see her situation through new eyes. As the afternoon light began to fade, Eleanor prayed over her, asking for guidance and courage. Remember, Eleanor said as they stood at the door, sometimes God puts us in dark places so we can be light for others. That evening, Lena found Julian in his home office, silhouetted against the city lights. He looked tired, his usual sharp edges softened by exhaustion. Could we talk? She asked softly. He gestured to a chair without looking up from his laptop. Make it quick. I have a board meeting in the morning. Lena sat, gathering her courage. Julian, do you ever think about the people affected by your company's decisions? His fingers stilled on the keyboard. What do you mean? The families losing their homes, the communities, being displaced. Do they matter less than profits? Julian's jaw tightened. You don't understand business. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good. Whose greater good? Lena pressed gently. The shareholders, or the single mothers trying to keep a roof over their children's heads. Look, he snapped, pushing back from his desk. I didn't create this system. I just work within it. But you have the power to change it, Lena said quietly. You could choose to put people first. Julian stood abruptly, pacing to the window. It's not that simple. There are contracts, obligations, expectations. Are they worth more than human lives? Her question hung in the air between them. Julian's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Lena saw past his polished exterior to the weight he carried. I used to believe I was building something important, he said finally, his voice barely audible. Somewhere along the way it became about the numbers, just endless columns of profit and loss, with people's names reduced to data points. He turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his eyes startled her. I don't know how to fix what I've broken, he admitted. The system is so big, so complex. One wrong move could collapse everything. Maybe some things need to collapse so they can be rebuilt better, Lena suggested softly. Julian sank back into his chair, looking lost. I don't even know where to start. The city lights twinkled beyond the window, each one representing a home, a family, a life. In the silence that followed, both of them felt the weight of those lives and the responsibility that came with the power to affect them. The morning sun painted golden stripes across Julian's desk as he stared at the contract before him. His pen hovered above the signature line, one stroke that would displace hundreds of families for a lucrative development deal. Lena's words from last night echoed in his mind. Maybe some things need to collapse so they can be rebuilt better. With deliberate slowness, he set the pen down. Cancel the Morrison Heights signing, he told his assistant through the intercom, and clear my schedule for the afternoon. His assistant's startled pause spoke volumes. Sir, the board has been pushing for this deal for months. I'm aware. Julian's voice was firm. I need to visit someone. 20 minutes later, he stood in his garage, ignoring his usual sleek sports car in favor of the old sedan he kept for sentimental reasons. The familiar leather seats still smelled like his father's cologne, bringing back memories of simpler times, before profits became more important than people. The drive to his mother's modest suburban home took 45 minutes. Each mile stirred up memories he'd buried under years of ambition and pride. His mother's disappointed face the last time he'd visited. The way she'd told him his father would have been ashamed of what the company had become. Julian parked across the street, studying the small house with its neat flower beds and wind chimes tinkling in the breeze. His mother had always loved those chimes. The sound used to annoy him. Now it made his chest ache with regret. Martha Reed was watering her petunias when he walked up the path. She froze, water spraying forgotten onto the sidewalk. Julian. "Hi, Mum." His voice cracked slightly. I should have called first." She set down the watering can, her movements careful, controlled. 3 years without a word, and now you show up unannounced?" There was hurt beneath her anger, deep and raw. "I know." Julian swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." Martha studied his face. Whatever she saw there made her expression soften slightly. "Come inside. I'll make coffee." The kitchen was exactly as he remembered. Yellow curtains, copper-bottomed pots hanging above the stove, family photos everywhere. Including, he noticed with a pang, the last picture taken of his father. "I saw your engagement announcement," Martha said as she measured coffee grounds. Quite a surprise. Julian sat at the familiar kitchen table, feeling too large for the space, too polished against its worn comfort. "That's complicated. Isn't it always with you?" She set 2 mugs down harder than necessary. "Is she pregnant? Is that why the sudden proposal?" "No, nothing like that." Julian wrapped his hands around the warm mug, anchoring himself. "Actually, I'm here because of her. Sort of. She reminds me of who I used to be, before everything got so twisted." Something in his voice made Martha really look at him. She sat down slowly. "Tell me." So he did. He told her about the housing scandal, about using Lena for publicity, about the quiet way she'd made him question everything he'd become. His mother listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. "She sounds like someone your father would have respected," Martha said finally. "He always said character matters more than circumstances." "I've forgotten that," Julian admitted. "I've forgotten a lot of important things." Martha reached across the table and took his hand, the first time she'd touched him in years. "It's never too late to remember, son." They talked for hours, really talked, about regret and redemption and the legacy his father had meant to leave. When Julian finally stood to leave, Martha hugged him tight. "Bring her to dinner soon," she whispered. "I want to meet the woman who helped my son find his way back." The sky was painted in sunset colors when Julian returned to his penthouse. He found Lena on the balcony, reading her Bible in the fading light. She looked up with a gentle smile that made his heart skip. "I went to see my mother today," he said, joining her at the railing. "How did it go?" "Better than I deserved." He turned to face her. "You know, when I first brought you into this mess, I thought I was saving my company. But you're actually saving me." Lena's eyes widened slightly. "Julian. I mean, it." His voice was rough with emotion. "This stopped being pretend for me a while ago. The way you see the world, the way you care about people, it's changing everything. I want to make things right, Lena. And I want to be worthy of someone like you." The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious. Lena's hand found his on the railing, their fingers intertwining naturally. No cameras, no pretense, just 2 hearts finding their way toward truth. "We could do so much good together," she whispered. Julian squeezed her hand, hope blooming in his chest for the first time in years. The city spread out below them, lights twinkling like stars, each one representing a life they could help, a wrong they could right. The moment was shattered by his phone chiming with an email notification. Julian pulled it out reluctantly, then went still as he read the message from the board. "Your recent behavior is concerning. The Morrison Heights delay is unacceptable. Choose carefully, Mr. Reed. Either recommit to our established business model, or your fiancée goes public with what she's learned about our operations. Her presence has become a liability we cannot afford. The phone felt heavy in his hand as he looked at Lena's profile, peaceful in the gathering dusk. For the first time in his career, Julian Reed faced a choice that money couldn't solve, and everything that mattered hung in the balance. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the corporate boardroom, but the atmosphere inside was ice-cold. Julian stood at one end of the long mahogany table, his hands pressed flat against its polished surface, facing the stern faces of the board members. "This little romance has gone far enough," Marcus Chen, the lead director, said. His voice carried the sharp edge of a blade. "Your recent decisions are threatening everything we've built." Elizabeth Blackwood, another board member, slid a tablet across the table. "Look at these numbers, Julian. The Morrison Heights delay alone has cost us millions, all because your fiancé made you soft." Julian's throat felt tight as he scanned the financial projections. Red arrows pointed downward everywhere he looked. "I was considering a more sustainable approach." "Sustainable?" Marcus barked out a laugh. "What's sustainable is profit. What's sustainable is keeping our shareholders happy. What's not sustainable is letting some homeless charity case derail years of careful planning." "Lena isn't..." Julian started to defend her, but Elizabeth cut him off. "Oh yes, about Miss Brooks." She produced a thick folder and began laying out documents one by one. No permanent address for the past 8 months, no stable employment history, living in her car when you found her. Quite the Cinderella story. Her smile was cruel. "Imagine how the press would love to hear how you orchestrated this whole engagement as a publicity stunt. How you took advantage of a desperate woman to save. Face." Julian's hands clenched into fists. "You wouldn't." "We won't have to," Marcus said smoothly. "If you get back on track, distance yourself from her. Show everyone it was just a temporary infatuation. Otherwise..." He shrugged. "Well, her reputation won't be the only thing we destroy. You've given us quite a paper trail of questionable decisions lately." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Julian thought of Lena's gentle smile, her quiet strength, the way she'd begun to heal parts of him he thought were broken beyond repair. Then he thought of everything he'd worked for, everything he'd sacrificed to build. "What do you want me to do?" His voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. Marcus smiled. "There's a press conference scheduled for 10 o'clock. Use it wisely." An hour later, Julian stood before a forest of microphones and cameras. His usual confidence felt like a mask that didn't quite fit anymore. But he wore it anyway, summoning the smooth charm that had served him so well over the years. "Yes, Lena Brooks is a wonderful woman," he said in response to a reporter's question. He forced a casual laugh. "But let's be honest, it was a whirlwind romance. Sometimes these things burn bright and fast. We're taking some time to reassess. My primary focus needs to be on the company and our upcoming projects." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Each carefully crafted statement drove another nail into the coffin of what he and Lena had started to build. He spoke about business prospects, about exciting new developments, about everything except the truth that was breaking his heart. Across town, in the luxury apartment that had briefly felt like a sanctuary, Lena watched the press conference on television. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, as Julian systematically dismantled their relationship for the cameras. Each word struck like a physical blow. "Sometimes these things burn bright and fast," she whispered along with him, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. When the press conference ended, Lena turned off the TV. The silence felt heavy, but not as heavy as the ring on her finger. She twisted it slowly, remembering the moment he'd placed it there. An act of desperation that had somehow grown into something real. Or so she'd thought. Moving with deliberate calm, Lena retrieved her old backpack from the closet. She packed only what she'd brought with her: some worn clothes, her grandmother's blanket, her Bible. The designer outfits they'd given her stayed hanging in the closet like costumes from a play that had ended too soon. The sun was setting by the time she finished, painting the penthouse in shades of gold and shadow. Lena took one last look around, memorizing the brief glimpse of security and comfort she'd experienced here. Then she slipped the ring off her finger and placed it carefully on the kitchen counter. It caught the fading light, sparkling like a tear. "Thank you," she whispered. To God, to Julian, to the brief possibility of what might have been. Then she shouldered her backpack and walked to the door. The elevator ride down was smooth and silent, just like the first time she'd come up. But this time, there were no PR teams waiting, no cameras flashing, no Julian standing beside her with that mix of desperation and hope in his eyes. Just Lena, alone again, stepping out into the gathering darkness. The doorman looked up in surprise as she passed. "Miss Brooks, would you like me to call a car?" Lena shook her head, managing a small smile. "No, thank you, Thomas. I'll walk. But it's getting dark." "It's all right," she said softly. "I'm used to the dark." The night air hit her face as she pushed through the revolving door, cool and clean after the artificial perfection of the penthouse. Traffic rushed by on the street, people hurried past on the sidewalk, the city pulsed with its usual energy, all of it completely unaware that Lena Brooks's fairy tale had just ended. She adjusted her backpack and began walking, her steps steady despite the ache in her heart. Behind her, the corporate tower rose into the sky like a monument to everything she'd almost had, and everything she'd been right to leave behind. The streetlights cast long shadows as Lena made her way through familiar neighborhoods, each step taking her further from the glittering world she'd briefly inhabited. Her feet knew the path to Eleanor's modest home on Pine Street, even though her mind was lost in a fog of hurt and confusion. It was nearly 9 o'clock when she finally reached the small house with its welcoming porch light. Eleanor opened the door before Lena could even knock, as if she'd been waiting. One look at Lena's face told her everything she needed to know. "Oh, sweet girl," Eleanor said softly, pulling her into a warm embrace. The familiar scent of Eleanor's home, cinnamon and fresh laundry, broke something inside Lena. She began to cry, quiet sobs that shook her whole body. Eleanor just held her tighter, one hand stroking her hair like she used to when Lena was young. "Come inside," Eleanor murmured after a few moments. "I'll make us some tea." The living room looked exactly as Lena remembered. Worn but comfortable furniture, family photos on every wall, a well-loved Bible on the coffee table. Eleanor guided her to the old flowered couch while the kettle heated on the stove. "I saw the press conference," Eleanor said gently, returning with 2 steaming mugs. "Do you want to talk about it?" Lena wrapped her hands around the warm cup, drawing comfort from its heat. "I thought," she started, then had to stop, as fresh tears threatened. "I really thought he was changing, that maybe God had put me there for a reason." Eleanor settled beside her on the couch. "Maybe he did, honey. Just not the reason you expected. I feel so foolish," Lena whispered. "Not because of the luxury or the clothes or any of that, but because I let myself hope. I started to believe that maybe—" She trailed off, staring into her tea. "That maybe love could change someone's heart." Eleanor finished for her. Lena nodded miserably. "Love can change hearts," Eleanor said, "but only when people are willing to let it. You showed Julian a different path, one of integrity and compassion. Whether he chooses to take it, well, that's between him and God now." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping tea and watching shadows play across the walls. Finally, Eleanor stood up. "The guest room is ready," she said. "I've kept it made up, just in case you ever needed it." Lena looked up at her, overwhelmed with gratitude. "How did you know?" Eleanor smiled. "Because I know you, Lena Brooks, and I knew that no amount of money or comfort would make you compromise what you believe in." That night, lying in the familiar twin bed with its faded quilt, Lena felt both broken and strangely peaceful. The room was nothing like the luxury apartment she'd left behind, just a simple space with second-hand furniture and a small cross on the wall. But it felt honest, real. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Julian's face on that television screen, so smoothly dismissing what they'd shared. The worst part was knowing that somewhere beneath his polished exterior, he was hurting too. She'd seen glimpses of his true self, the man who visited his mother after years of silence, who admitted he wanted to make things right. But in the end, he'd chosen power over truth. Again. Morning came slowly, seeping through thin curtains and bringing with it a new kind of clarity. Lena rose early, folding her grandmother's blanket with careful hands. She could smell coffee brewing downstairs. Eleanor was already in the kitchen, reading her Bible at the small round table. She looked up with a warm smile. "There's fresh coffee, and I made oatmeal." "Thank you," Lena said, meaning it for so much more than breakfast. She sat down across from Eleanor, cradling the coffee mug. "I need to return those clothes they gave me." Eleanor nodded. "We can drop them off at the donation center on 3rd Street. Then maybe you'd like to come with me to the shelter. They're always short-handed on Thursdays." Lena felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were different. Tears of gratitude for this steady friend who knew exactly what she needed. "I'd like that." They spent the morning sorting through the designer clothes Lena had packed. Each item represented a role she'd tried to play, a world she'd briefly visited but never truly belonged to. She folded them carefully, remembering moments, a charity gala, a press conference, quiet dinners with Julian. Then she placed them in boxes, ready to be given to people who needed them more than she did. The shelter was busy when they arrived, filled with familiar faces and new ones too. Lena tied on an apron and got to work in the kitchen, finding comfort in the simple act of serving others. Here, no one cared about her brief brush with fame. They just appreciated the extra hands, the warm smile, the gentle word of encouragement. During a quiet moment, Lena slipped into the shelter's small chapel. Sunlight filtered through the single stained glass window, casting colored shadows on the worn carpet. She knelt in the last pew, hands clasped tightly. "Lord," she whispered, "I don't ask for revenge. I don't even ask for understanding. Just, please give me strength to keep walking your path. Help me hold on to my integrity, even when it hurts. And—" She hesitated, then added softly, "Please watch over Julian too." The prayer settled around her like a comfortable blanket, not taking away the pain, but making it bearable. When she opened her eyes, she saw Eleanor standing quietly in the doorway, respect and pride shining in her eyes. "Come on," Eleanor said gently. "There's work to be done." Lena stood up, smoothing her simple dress. Yes, there was work to be done. Not the kind that made headlines or impressed board members, but the kind that mattered. One meal, one kind word, one act of service at a time. She followed Eleanor back to the kitchen, leaving behind the glitter and glamour of Julian's world without regret. She might have lost a fairy tale, but she'd kept something far more precious, her soul's integrity, built on truth and compassion rather than lies and profit. The afternoon sun streamed through the shelter's windows as Lena worked, warming her face and reminding her that even after the darkest nights, morning always comes, and with it, the strength to begin again. The morning after Lena's departure, Julian Reed stood at his office window, watching protesters gather below. Their signs seemed to mock him now. People over profits and stop the corporate greed. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from concerned board members and anxious investors. He picked up his crystal tumbler, studying the amber liquid inside, then set it down untouched. The sun glinted off the polished surface of his desk where Lena's ring still lay, a silent accusation. "Mr. Reed." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Morgan Stanley is pulling their backing. They're citing unstable leadership decisions." Julian's jaw tightened. "Schedule an emergency call with them for this afternoon." "Sir, they've declined further meetings, and the Times wants a comment about Ms. Brooks's sudden departure." The walls of his carefully constructed world were starting to crack. He could almost hear them splintering like ice breaking up in spring. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from his mother. "I'm downstairs. We need to talk." Julian's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain control by keeping her at arm's length like he had for years. But something in him had shifted. Maybe it was Lena's influence, or maybe he was just tired of running. "Send her up," he told his assistant, Margaret Reed. Entered his office like a storm front, all contained energy and stern grace. Her silver hair was swept back in its usual elegant style, but her eyes held none of their usual careful distance. "So," she said, settling into the chair across from him without waiting for an invitation. "You've managed to make quite a mess of things." "Mother, I don't have time." "You never have time. That's part of the problem." She leaned forward, fixing him with the kind of look that had once sent him to his room as a child. "I watched that press conference where you dismissed that young woman, watched you throw away something real to protect something hollow." Julian's fingers tightened on his armrest. "The company—" "The company?" His mother's laugh was sharp. "Julian, the company is just a structure of papers and promises, but you've made it your whole world, convinced yourself that control equals strength." She shook her head. "Your father would be disappointed." The words hit like a physical blow. Dad built this company. Your father built relationships, trust. He understood that real strength comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down. She stood, smoothing her skirt. "That young woman saw the real you, the one I remember, the one who used to care about more than just the bottom line, and instead of embracing that, you chose fear." Julian turned away, staring out at the city skyline. But his mother wasn't finished. "You've become the kind of man who mistakes control for strength," she said quietly. "And until you face that truth, you'll keep losing the things that matter most." She left him standing there, her words echoing in the empty office. Throughout the afternoon, the hits kept coming. 3 major investors pulled out. The press ran stories questioning his stability, his judgment, his character. His phone kept buzzing with messages from board members demanding explanations, strategies, damage control. As evening settled over the city, Julian found himself alone in his penthouse. The space felt cavernous now, empty of Lena's quiet presence. He wandered from room to room, remembering moments, her gentle questions about the protesters, her kindness to the cleaning staff, her prayers for strangers at the gala. In his home office, he pulled up security footage from that day at the press conference, watching himself drop to one knee in front of Lena. He'd been desperate then, acting on instinct rather than calculation. But something real had grown from that staged moment, something he'd destroyed with a few carefully chosen words on television. Her voice echoed in his memory. "Do you believe people matter more than profits?" He hadn't been able to answer then. But now, sitting in his empty penthouse with his empire crumbling around him, he finally understood. He'd lost Lena because he'd lost himself long ago, sacrificing principle for power, compassion for control. The realization settled over him like a heavy weight. Outside his window, the city lights blurred together, and for the first time in years, Julian Reed put his head in his hands and wept, not for the company he might lose, but for the man he'd failed to be. His phone buzzed again, probably another crisis demanding attention. But he left it there, letting himself feel the full weight of his choices, of his losses. The truth Lena had tried to show him was finally, painfully clear. He'd built his life on shifting sand, mistaking wealth for worth and power for purpose. In the stillness of his penthouse, surrounded by all the trappings of success that suddenly meant nothing, Julian remembered the look in Lena's eyes when she'd asked him that simple question about what truly mattered. He hadn't been able to answer then, too caught up in his carefully constructed facade. But now, in the ruins of that facade, the answer was crystal clear. He picked up the ring from his desk, turning it over in his hands. The diamond caught the city lights, sparkling with the same quiet brilliance he'd seen in Lena's integrity. He'd offered it as a prop in a desperate play for control. She'd worn it with grace, until conscience demanded otherwise. The night deepened around him as he sat there, finally facing the truth about the man he'd become, and the man he'd stopped being somewhere along the way. The morning sun cast long shadows across Julian's office as he straightened his tie one final time. His hands trembled slightly, but his resolve remained firm. On his desk lay a thick folder of documents, evidence of years of predatory practices, forged papers, and buried complaints. Everything he'd helped cover up, everything he'd justified in the name of profit. His assistant knocked softly. "Sir, the press is gathering in the main conference room. The board members are demanding to know what this is about." "Thank you, Sarah," Julian said quietly. "And I'm sorry for the times I wasn't the leader you deserved." She blinked, surprised by this unprecedented display of humility from her usually controlled boss. "Sir, just something I should have said a long time ago." He picked up the folder and walked towards the door, pausing briefly. "Whatever happens next, you've been an excellent assistant." The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. Julian's mind wandered to his mother's words, to Lena's quiet strength, to all the lives affected by his choices. The weight of the folder in his hands seemed to grow with each floor they descended. The main conference room was packed, reporters, shareholders, board members, all buzzing with speculation about this unexpected morning meeting. Camera flashes erupted as Julian entered. He noticed several board members exchanging worried glances, no doubt wondering if he'd finally lost his mind. Julian stepped up to the podium, placing the folder deliberately in front of him. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on the man who, just days ago, had publicly distanced himself from a woman who had shown him a better way. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I've called this press conference to tell the truth, the complete truth, about everything." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One tried to catch his eye, making a subtle cutting motion across his throat. Julian ignored him. "For years, this company has engaged in systematic exploitation of vulnerable communities through our housing developments." He opened the folder, pulling out the first document. "These papers show how we deliberately targeted low-income neighborhoods, using predatory lending practices and false promises to force people from their homes." Gasps rippled through the room. Cameras clicked frantically. A board member stood up, trying to interrupt, but Julian continued, his voice growing stronger. We forged documents. We buried complaints. We silenced those who tried to speak up. He held up paper after paper, evidence of years of calculated cruelty. I approved these policies. I signed these orders. I chose profit over people time and time again. The room erupted in chaos. Reporters shouted questions. Shareholders jumped to their feet. But Julian pressed on, determined to empty himself of every dark secret, every buried truth. As of this moment, I am resigning as Chief Executive Officer of Reed Enterprises. The announcement brought stunned silence. Furthermore, I am establishing a restitution fund of $500 million, the majority of my personal assets, to help rebuild the communities we destroyed. One of the board members finally pushed his way to the podium. This is unauthorized. He's having some sort of breakdown. I am completely sound of mind. Julian cut in firmly. And I'm not finished. He turned back to the crowd. I am also announcing the immediate conversion of our newest development projects into affordable housing units, managed by community organizations with full transparency and oversight. The board member grabbed his arm. You can't do this. You'll destroy everything. Julian gently but firmly removed the man's hand. No, I'm finally fixing what we destroyed. He faced the cameras again. Every document I've mentioned will be made available to investigators. Every victim of our practices will be contacted and compensated. Every member of leadership who participated in these decisions, myself included, should face whatever legal consequences are appropriate. The chaos in the room reached a fever pitch. Shareholders were shouting about stock prices and lawsuits. Reporters were firing questions faster than anyone could process them. Board members were on their phones, presumably calling their lawyers. But Julian felt lighter than he had in years. He looked out at the crowd, seeing not threats or opportunities, but human beings. Like Lena had seen, like he used to see, before ambition corrupted his vision. One last thing, he said, and something in his voice made the room quiet again. To everyone we hurt, I am deeply, profoundly sorry. To everyone who trusted me to lead with integrity, I failed you. And to one particular person who showed me that real strength lies in doing what's right, not what's safe. He paused, thinking of Lena's gentle questions and unwavering principles. Thank you for helping me find my conscience again. He stepped back from the podium, gathering the documents carefully. Security guards were moving in, probably under orders from the board to contain the situation. But they were too late. The truth was out, flying across airwaves and social media, impossible to contain. Julian walked toward the exit, passing stunned faces and rolling cameras. Someone called out asking what he would do now. He didn't answer. His custom-made shoes clicked against the marble floor as he crossed the lobby one last time. Outside, the morning sun was bright and clear. Julian loosened his tie, took a deep breath of fresh air, and began walking. Behind him, he could hear the building erupting in chaos, his carefully built empire crumbling under the weight of truth. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Julian Reed was walking tall, carrying nothing but his conscience. And somehow, that felt like everything. 6 months passed like quiet rainfall, washing away old pain and nourishing new growth. The Maria Brooks Housing Initiative had become a beacon of hope in Chicago's struggling neighborhoods, turning empty promises into solid foundations and broken dreams into rebuilt homes. On a warm autumn afternoon, Lena stood in the doorway of a freshly renovated house, clipboard in hand, watching volunteers carry in furniture. The setting sun painted everything in soft gold, reminding her of her grandmother's favorite saying, "Light always finds its way through the cracks." Among the volunteers, Julian worked steadily, his expensive suits long replaced by worn jeans and faded t-shirts. He carried boxes and assembled furniture alongside everyone else, never mentioning his role in funding the program. Most of the other volunteers didn't even recognize him anymore. His face had faded from the headlines, replaced by stories of community renewal. As the day wound down and the last truck pulled away, Lena found Julian sitting on the front steps of the house they'd just finished. His hands were calloused now, marked by honest work instead of boardroom battles. He looked up as she approached, his eyes clearer than she'd ever seen them. "I've been wanting to say something," he said quietly, moving over to make room for her on the step. "But I wanted to wait until my actions could speak first." Lena sat beside him, feeling the cooling concrete through her worn jeans. The street was peaceful, lined with homes they'd helped restore over the past months. "I'm sorry," Julian continued, his voice steady but humble. "Not just for how I treated you, but for every person I hurt before I met you. I won't make excuses. I won't promise I'll never make mistakes again." He looked at his work-roughened hands. "I can only keep trying to rebuild what I broke, one day at a time." Lena watched his profile in the fading light, seeing not the polished CEO who had once proposed to her in desperation, but the man who had chosen to lose everything to find himself. She saw someone who had learned to measure wealth not in dollars, but in the smiles of families returning to restored homes. She reached over and squeezed his hand briefly, a gesture of understanding, of forgiveness, of recognition for the person he had become. A few weeks later, the golden hour stretched across the community garden they'd helped plant, beside their first renovated home. Julian found Lena there, tending to the tomato plants that would feed local families. The evening air was warm and sweet with the scent of growing things. He watched her for a moment, remembering how she'd looked that first day in the corporate building, invisible to everyone except him. Now she glowed with purpose, her quiet strength touching countless lives. "Lena," he called softly, walking toward her between the neat rows of vegetables. She turned, brushing soil from her hands. The setting sun caught her face, and Julian's heart squeezed with the simple truth of what he felt. "I've been thinking," he said, reaching for her hand, "about how we met, and everything that's happened since." His voice was steady, honest in a way it had never been during that first desperate proposal. Lena's eyes met his, seeing all the changes time and choice had carved into him. "The first time I asked you to marry me, I was trying to save myself," Julian continued, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I didn't understand then that I needed to change, not be rescued." He took a deep breath. "But now I'm asking because I want to walk beside you, not as someone who needs saving, but as someone who wants to build something real with you." Slowly, deliberately, he knelt in the rich garden soil. This time, there were no cameras, no desperate schemes, just two people who had found truth in the rubble of lies. "Will you marry me, Lena Brooks?" Tears glimmered in her eyes as she looked down at him. "Yes," she whispered, "because I see who you've become." The next day they stood together at the community dedication ceremony for the garden. The mayor had come to cut the ribbon, but Lena and Julian stayed in the background, their joined hands speaking louder than any speech. Around them, children played while parents gathered vegetables and elderly neighbors rested on newly installed benches. Their love had grown like the garden itself, not in the artificial light of publicity, but in the honest soil of shared purpose. Their fingers intertwined as they watched their community thrive, knowing their future would be built not on deception, but on dignity, faith, and unwavering truth. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.